Hi, everyone. I'm thrilled to welcome you to this latest edition of ELI on Air, the weekly ELI Talks interactive broadcast where we talk with interesting folks from across the Jewish spectrum about ideas of Jewish engagements, literacy, and identity. My name is Miriam Berceau, and I'm the ELI Talks program director, and I am very, very excited and honored to be sitting here today with Rabbi Benay Lappe of Sfara, a traditionally radical yeshiva, and Dr. Daniel Libenson of the Institute for the Next Jewish Future, both of whom are really dynamic and inspiring speakers who gave wonderful talks over the past couple of years of ELI Talks, and we'll be digging deeper into some of the ideas they presented in those talks today. We've also got on board Esther Kostanowitz, who is the ELI Talks community manager, and so she'll be helping us out throughout the conversation, grabbing your questions as they come in. ELI on Air is a totally interactive show, and so we'll be taking your questions throughout. Please feel free to submit them right through Google+, and that involves just clicking on this little black box here in the lower left-hand corner of your video, opening it up in Google+. You may have to sign into your Google account in order to send in your questions. You can also share your questions in the event on Facebook or on Twitter using hashtag ELITalks, and we'll take those live on the air. And with that, Esther is going to go behind the scenes for just a moment to take care of all of those questions, but she'll be joining us again at the end. And with that, we'll jump right into our conversation with our two luminaries of the Jewish world today. So thank you both for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to having this conversation. Could we just start, Dan, I'll ask you to kick us off. Could you just give us a summary and maybe some highlights from the ELI talk that you gave and some of the takeaways from that video that you shared?
Sure. Well, the idea that I'm trying to promote in my talk is that we should really think hard about what we mean by innovation when we're talking about innovation in the Jewish community. And if we think that the innovation that we need is a large innovation, later about why Benay and I think that it is, that when we see innovation happening in other sectors of the world, I talked a lot about the world of technology and business, but I think we can see that in all kinds of other walks of life, that real paradigm-shifting innovation, and here I'm using the work of Clayton Christensen, who's a professor of business at Harvard, who has a framework called disruptive innovation, where he really looks at how game-changing innovations come about. And they tend not to come about through tweaking the existing product or the existing system, but rather from a completely new startup or something that's happening far outside the existing system. And that thing grows and grows and grows over time, and eventually it gets good enough that it starts to attract people from within the system into this new thing. They bring with them their ideas and their things that they're committed to from the old system, and so some of the old things become incorporated into the new thing, but the innovation and the paradigm shift really came about from a seed that was planted far outside of the mainstream. So essentially what I'm encouraging in my talk is that the Jewish community pay a lot more attention and invest much more in what I call the R&D sector of Jewish life, or the experimental sector of Jewish life, which are really programs, and not even programs, but even things that are just happening far outside of the mainstream. And that if we saw that as the potential source of the Jewish future, as opposed to some interesting things happening out on the fringes, then I think we would invest more in it, and we would find ways to encourage more of that to happen. And I think that in the Jewish community, when we talk about innovation or change, I think we tend to be talking about tweaks along the margins of the sort of center of Jewish life, as opposed to things that are happening far outside the mainstream. And I think that's not a critique of the Jewish world in particular. I think that's true of every system. Thomas Kuhn, in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, talks about this also as far as science goes, that it's not uncommon that the people who are in the center of things as they exist today are sort of trapped within their own view of things and can't even imagine changes that are too far out. And so I'm really encouraging us to encourage more of that experimentation out on the margins and to invest more in it. The second major point that I make in my talk that I think is relevant to what we're talking today is that we should really find a way of cultivating Jewish leaders who either start from outside of the Jewish community, or outside of the mainstream of the Jewish community, or who start within the mainstream of the Jewish community, and essentially we push them out and encourage them to really go outside and really, in the words that we're using for this conversation today, to become hackers and to really play with all the knowledge that they have and build something very new, which is essentially what hackers do. So that we should really be encouraging a hacker leadership as opposed to whatever we might call the kind of leadership that this dominant form of leadership today in Jewish life and in any major institution in the center of it. So those are the main ideas.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. And I'll just say we've had several people just join us. Again, we are accepting your questions throughout the entire broadcast, so feel free to submit them through the video or on Twitter using hashtag ELI Talks, and we'll answer those live on the air. Benay, can I pass it over to you? Give us a quick summary of some of the highlights from your talk.
Sure. What I was trying to do in my talk was say that we are at a time of enormous change, and we've been here before. And we actually know a lot about how things work in times of enormous change. And I laid out what I call my crash theory, which in short goes like this. The idea is that we all share the same basic human questions. How do we love? How should I live my life? What's right? What's wrong? And every civilization, every culture, every religion comes into being for one and only one reason, and that is to answer those questions. And it does so by means of a master story. And if your master story is working for you, you're very happy and you're not even where you have questions. But every story will ultimately and inevitably crash. That story will, for some reason, no longer work for you, either as a result of some historical event which makes your master story no longer workable. Think destruction of the temple, think 9/11, or because some other competing story actually makes more sense to you and gives you better answers. Think feminism, evolution, or because something inside of you has changed and those old answers just don't seem true anymore. So think realizing you're gay, coming out. And whatever the crash is, whether it's communal or personal, there are three and only three possible options ever to any crash. And I think knowing what those options are and having a quick shorthand for them, and I call them option 1, option 2, and option 3, gives us a way to analyze in a sort of quick and dirty, easy way what's going on and how different people are responding to our crash and whether these responses are helping or not so helpful. So these three possible options to any crash are, number one, option 1, that you deny the crash or you severely underestimate its impact. And you revert to option 1 and you build a wall around that story and you do whatever you can to maintain it. And this would be, in Dan's terms, sustaining innovation. Even if you recognize that something is going on, it's a tweak. Making things better so that option 1, you hope, has some more legs. And it's an investment in the current system. Option 2 is completely rejecting your current story and jumping off into a new story. And remember, you're always in a story. And there are upsides and downsides to each of these. But the third option is to take what still works from your original master story and retell that story so that it works better. That's the hacking. And this option 3 would be disruptive innovation. And what I proposed in my talk is that the people best suited to go option 3, to be disruptive innovators, just as Dan said, are those who are on the margins. those for whom the current system has already not been working for a while. And as a queer person, you know, LGBTQ queer folk have been on the front leading edge of this ain't working for us for a long time. And we figured out some things about that. And I play a little bit with the term queer because I think just as feminism doesn't break down on gender lines, you can be a man and be a feminist, and you can be a woman and not be a feminist. Being queer also doesn't break down on sexual orientation lines. You can be straight and be queer, depending on how you think about the world, whether you have an outsider perspective, whether you have kind of embraced some unique experience of your own and use that to bring a critique to the mainstream. And you can be gay and not be queer. You know, you can just be all about, I want in. And while I think that LGBTQ queer people have a particular sort of suitability for Jewish leadership right now, because after all, queer people get crash. If you are queer and you have survived, it means you get crash and you have the ability to embrace your uniqueness in spite of all the stuff that's going to happen to you, in spite of everything the world says to you, and live out of that. And I think that's the kind of courageousness and insight we need in leaders. But also, everybody's got some queer. And what I tried to say was find your queer and figure out what insight you have and bring that to the conversation.
Excellent. Yeah. So I think one of the fundamental questions that I want to get to is, why now? What is it about right now at this point in Jewish history that makes both of you feel and say in your, very explicitly in your talks that now is the time to think about crash, now is the time to think about disruptive innovation?
And you want to start?
Well, we were talking about this earlier, Benay and I, in terms of trying to think about this question. One of the things that Benay talked about was, that one of the things is just to look at the evidence on the ground. I mean, look at the numbers of Jews who are not affiliating with Jewish institutions and Jewish life as we have them today. And those numbers are large and growing. And there's some evidence, and it seems like there's a lot of evidence that the way we're doing things now is not working for a lot of people. Is it working for enough people? It's hard to say. How do we define that? And I think that that's an interesting conversation. But I think that our perspective is there's a lot of people for whom Judaism could work, for whom the content of our 3,000-year heritage could be valuable in their lives, but they're not accessing it because the only way that it's really available is through a variety of institutions that seem to be unable to win their participation. So I'd say that one way of looking at that question is just looking at the affiliation numbers. I think, though, that behind those affiliation numbers are deep issues that we could talk about for a long, long time. But I think that when we talk about this order of change, we need to be looking in sort of historical time, geological time, right, and not just, the last 5 years. And I think that what we're dealing with is fundamentally the product of the Enlightenment and the Emancipation, and it's that we've been dealing with for 200 or 300 years. I actually think that what's anomalous about the time that we are right now is that the Holocaust and the founding of the State of Israel kind of created a certain momentum behind Jewish affiliation for a while, for a lot of people, that made us sort of not have to confront some of these issues of disaffiliation in quite the sort of emergency way that that we were actually confronting them before. And so I think when we look at some of our sort of ancestors as intellectuals, or the early reformers, or Mordechai Kaplan, or Rosenzweig, or other people who I think in the late 19th century and the early 20th century were dealing with exactly what we're dealing with again now, and And those are forces that come about because of things such as the capacity for Jews to make an individual decision whether or not to participate in Jewish community in any meaningful way. That is a choice that we've had since the emancipation, more and more, and in America, very, very much, that fundamentally means that Judaism has to appeal to us as individuals, otherwise we are unlikely to affiliate, even to affiliate communally. So even if you say that Judaism is fundamentally a communal endeavor, it's still an individual choice whether or not to affiliate with that community. And that's something that Judaism hasn't really evolved to have as a component of its makeup. And so I think that just as one example, there's no reason to think that a religion or a community that basically was formed in an environment in which its members were kind of stuck there, maybe not unhappily so, but that they basically didn't really have a choice whether or not to affiliate. So that system develops in a certain way, and there's no reason really to expect that a system that developed that way would be capable of attracting individuals to participate in it once that those external forces were gone. That's what was being dealt with in the late 19th century, and I think that that's what we're dealing with again after something of a pause.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree with Dan completely that this crash we're in began with a crumble, let's say. I think every crash starts with a crumble that began with the emancipation and enlightenment. And what happens in these times is that lots and lots of option threes come about, and that's what you want. So the origin of the movements, including Orthodoxy, were the beginnings of option threes. Zionism was an option three, which is having its own return crash. It's now having a crash. It was a response to a crash. Now it's crashing itself in many ways. And if you look at what's going on today in American Judaism, the proliferation of experimental forms of Judaism, I think are indications that we're in a crash, big time. That lots isn't working, and I'm very encouraged by this proliferation of option threes, by the Moishe houses and the Avodas and the JUs at the University of Chicago and the Mishkans and the Svaras, and this is telling me that things aren't working for lots of people, and they're doing something about it.
Mm-hmm. So I think a part of what we're implying in this conversation is that if the Jewish community wants to survive and thrive, then it's important to pay attention to these innovative edges, right? And but I think for a lot of folks who are already deeply invested in Jewish life and Jewish institutions, it's hard to kind of get out of that space and really see beyond to those innovative edges and really understand what the possibilities are and how people are pushing boundaries. So could you say a little bit about sort of what that takes and what it looks like to even recognize the new and innovative things that are happening, and then how do you decide kind of what to invest in, what to latch onto, and say this is where I'm banking my future?
You know, there's one example in Clayton Christensen's work that I think is really interesting with regard to this. You know, he writes about companies that are sort of facing a sort of disruptions happening outside. You know, we can even think of like the barbarians at the gates, right? And what do they do? And you know, for all sorts of reasons that he goes into in his books, The Innovator's Dilemma and other books, you know, he says it's actually really hard, even for the best managed companies, to deal with that kind of innovation that's happening on the periphery. because it's just never the right decision for them at any moment in time to sort of shift their investment from their current customers, who really are actually very happy with the product that as it is and who are paying for it, to these new customers who actually may not be able to afford very much. You know, they might be young, they might be not willing to pay very much for whatever reason. It's just never the right choice to do. But he described some examples of when this was done successfully, and one that's really interesting about a company that we know a lot about is that when the department store industry was sort of under a disruptive threat from the big box retailing kind of industry, you know, Walmart and such, they didn't know what to do, and they couldn't really compete with that. But one company, Dayton Hudson Corporation, bought a little tiny company and invested in it, and basically said to them, "You guys, you know, do this discount retail thing. We don't really understand it, you know, but we see that there's something going on out there that we're going to be in big trouble if we don't respond. You do what you need to do. You can compete with us. You can undersell us. You can do whatever you want. We're going to invest in you, so we'll see some of the profits from that if it turns out that there are profits." And that little company was called Target. And it eventually grew to be so big that they changed the name of the company from the Dayton Hudson Corporation to the Target Corporation, and they ended up selling the department store business to Macy's. So, so that's one way. So, you know, you think about the Jewish community. You know, we often think about how can we change synagogues, how can we change federations, how can we, you know, change JCCs in some way so that they can really see what's needed and add those things to their work somehow, but that might not be possible, and that might not be the right approach. It may be that we want to encourage them essentially to have a diversified portfolio of investment and to invest in a number of different things and not try to do them themselves, and try to see if some of these things flourish, precisely because it may well be impossible for those on the inside to understand what's going on far, far, far outside well enough to really be able to do much more than try to take some educated gambles and do what they can to allow those things that are happening on the outside to have a chance of flourishing, because they recognize that only if one of them ends up flourishing and they can, you know, they can rename the corporation and sort of give them the keys, you know, that's the only chance, because otherwise we're going bankrupt, you know, and that is the real possibility that I think we really should be looking at.
And I think it's the impulse of those in the option one world to want to bring those from the margins into the center. And the most forward-thinking of these option one approaches are, let's do outreach. Let's find a way to attract young people so that, and let's do some innovative things, with the ultimate goal being so then they'll come to our show. Then they'll come to this institution. And I agree with Dan completely. That's the wrong way to go. I think our current institutions have to be willing to cannibalize themselves in order to allow for these new experiments on the margins to really flourish. You see this in the Jewish world's response to gay people. You either have an attempt to help sort of those poor gay people feel better about themselves, or the inclusion model, which is, let's make gay people feel comfortable here, which is okay. I suppose that's a good thing. It's better than not doing that, but it really doesn't help the Jewish world. What's going to help the Jewish world is not that the people who are now on the outside feel better and an inside that isn't largely working, but rather that they become empowered and equipped to bring their insights to the table and create new Judaisms on the margins, which, you know, as Dan describes in his talk, will slowly bring people from the center there to a more thriving, functioning form.
So Rabbi Lappe, one of the things that I love at the very beginning of your talk is your description of donkey stories, and
Yeah.
saying, giving this idea that if donkeys read the Torah or if donkeys read the Talmud, all of the donkey stories would jump out of them, and they would see themselves in that story. And you equate that to your seeing yourself and your story and the story of so many others who are involved in Svara and other communities. Seeing themselves in these kinds of texts, in these stories. So can you say a little bit more about donkey stories, about how you find yourself in these traditional texts, and what's the role of donkey stories in sort of finding and empowering these folks at the innovative edge?
Yeah, it's super important. This was an idea originated by a British theologian named Jonathan Maginot. And as you say, he imagines a donkey reading Torah. And he says, if donkeys read Torah, what would they see? They'd see themselves. They'd see the donkey stories. They would notice all those places that were describing them, that the rest of us don't even notice because we're not donkeys. And what's important about donkey stories is that they're essential parts of the master narrative that are ignored by the mainstream, but where there's enormous wisdom. And in order to recognize donkey stories, you first have to recognize where in yourself your queerness is. And I'm using this in the biggest sense. Where is your unique life experience that gives you some wisdom? And there's a Jewish term for this. It's called svara. One's moral intuition comes from the insight which you get on your particular experience that nobody else has. And that's your wisdom, and that's your sort of piece of the puzzle that the tradition you're involved in, the society you're involved in, needs to have. And once you become clear about your queerness, whatever that is, whether it's that you actually are LGBTQ, whether it's your experience as someone who was adopted, who is disabled, who lived abroad for many years, who has some experience other than the norm, then you can find those parts of the tradition that have been ignored at the tradition's peril. That because you have this lens, you can now see. And you can now bring this out for everyone's benefit. Yitz Greenberg talks about the radicalness of Passover. What's the radicalness of Passover? That this one small group of people who had a particular experience of their own, enslavement in Egypt, said, not because I had this experience, I should be free, we should be free, that's what we figured out, but because we had this experience, everybody should be free. Mm. That's queer. And I think it's that's the way big ideas that change the world happen. People figure out who they are, what their unique insight is, and they find where that is in the tradition and elevate it for the benefit of everybody.
Mm-hmm. Dan, did you have anything to add about donkey stories, about you finding your donkey story?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, I think that the way in which I'm a donkey is that, right, I'm a kind of dissatisfied Jew who loves Judaism, right, who is looking for a way to be satisfied, right, and looking for a way to feel at home in this. And I remember when I first met Benay, and she started talking about the Talmud. I kind of the Talmud. Of all things, like that's the thing that has all these laws in it that I don't feel, that I don't relate to, and that I don't feel satisfied by. And she said, no, you totally misunderstanding this. The Talmud is the record of a previous number of, previous generation of dissatisfied optimists, whose Judaism had crashed around them, and who said, can we still rescue some of the parts that we really still love, and can we put them together in a new way so that we don't have to lose the whole thing? And the Talmud is essentially the record of those people doing that. If it turns out that what they put together is no longer working for us today, then what the story really is about is how we can rescue the parts of what they built that we still like and recreate something new again. And just that sort of change of lens to understand, that the Talmud is full of donkeys like me, totally opened my eyes in my life to saying that Talmud study, wow, that should become a part of my Judaism, which I never would have seen if it hadn't been for, sort of Benay unmasking those donkey stories for me in that particular case.
Mm-hmm. And for me, that my life experience as a lesbian gave me a certain, set of antennas that allowed me to recognize other people who were sort of on the margins of their own times and making changes that came from a similarly queer sensibility. So I began to see the rabbis as queer and recognize that what they're doing isn't telling us how to live. What they're doing is telling us how to respond to crashes. They knew there would be crashes in every generation, and the Talmud is the handbook for how to do that. And it completely changes what you think of as Jewish education or what Jewish education should be about in a time of crash. If you're in a very stable period during which your option one is working for lots and lots of people, Jewish education can be, hey, this is what our system is. This is what it's been, and this is what it is. But when you're in a time of crash, Jewish education has to be something completely different. It's got to be a little bit of, this is what Judaism is, with the mindset of, as Dan says, this is what it's been. But also never neglecting the notion that it is up to every single Jew, not to those who have rabbinic ordination, but every single Jew. And the tradition says this, that every individual has the potential to be gamirna and savirna, learned and bring their moral intuition to bear, to mess with, experiment with, upgrade the tradition. That rabbinic ordination is not at all required. And what we need to do in Jewish education is to show the learners how incredibly complex, sophisticated, and smart the tradition is, and get them to fall in love with it. It's not easy once you show them that. And then explain that they're players, and they are empowered to work with the system. It's a very different approach, I think, to Jewish education.
Yeah, and I'd like to pick up on that because I think that when we talk about Jewish education in the Jewish community, we seem to have this notion that if somebody were to only receive an education, if they would only learn more and more, somehow they would learn enough, and then they would come to want to be part of this, and they would kind of stop with their rebelliousness, and they would just kind of understand that this is a wonderful system, and I want to be a part of it. And I don't think that's certainly not a great view of education in a time of change. I'm not even sure that it's a great view of education in the time of stability. And if we think of other things like music and art, right, then we think of the ultimate educated person becomes a creator, right? And if somebody learned a lot about music and art, and all they could do would be to reproduce what had been created by other musicians and artists, then it seems to me that would kind of disappointing end result of And so, part of what I talked about a little bit in my talk and want to think about a lot more is saying, I said that we talk about Jewish literacy a lot, but we seem to have a concept of Jewish literacy that means that you can read, right? That means that you can appreciate what somebody else has written. But I think that the ultimate expression of literacy is actually the capacity to write, or the capacity to compose music, or the capacity to create great art. And so, and again, I think that that's fundamentally what we mean when we talk about a hacker, right? A hacker is somebody who has vast understanding of this technology, but who takes it apart and puts it back together in an interesting way and creates new things for people who aren't able to get what they need out of the things that have existed up until now. And I feel like in every other walk of life, we see innovation, and by innovation I mean bold innovation and game-changing, things that are very, very different from what we have today. We see that as genius, right? We see that as the most wonderful thing that we can imagine. But in Judaism, we tend to have a notion that if you kind of go too far, it's not all right, it's not right anymore, and it's not authentic, and it's not traditional, and I don't think that that serves us well, and it doesn't serve us well to have a vision of education that suggests that that is a happy endpoint.
So we've had a couple of questions come in, both sort of encouraging us to come down from theory and dig into some practical or on-the-ground implications of some of these. So we had one question come in from Lex asking about who are the key populations that are ripe for this kind of empowerment. And I hesitate to say who should we be investing in, because that feels like sort of the wrong perspective based on the conversation that we've been having so far. So who are those key populations that are sort of ripe for this kind of empowerment? And we had a similar question come in right through Google Plus asking, what is the one concrete thing that those who care about the Jewish future should be doing? What's a sort of practical next step that we can take?
So let me start with the Pew Study, because I think that the Pew Study gives us some language for this. Right, the Pew Study famously identified this large population, and it's larger with younger Jews, of Jews of no religion. And we can sort of debate over how the question was phrased and what that really means. But I think what we see in other parts of American life also is that traditional religion is not the way that many young people are defining themselves. And I think there's a stereotype among the sort of, again, within the Jewish community, that what it means to be a non-religious Jew or a Jew of no religion would be just shallow, and it would be Judaism. You would be eating bagels or something like that. But I think that our challenge would be to encourage and to encourage experiments in the world of the Jews of no religion as to what might a rich, meaningful Judaism that's not religious in nature, what might that really look like? There's not an easy question to that. I don't have the answer. I think that, but I think that if the Jewish community encouraged tremendous experimentation in that realm, made tremendous financial investments in all kinds of ideas of people who are trying to experiment in that space, that may well be one of those very concrete sort of populations that we should be looking at, because it certainly seems like it's among the biggest. I mean, sure, LGBT Jews, of course, and I mean, I'm looking at Lex's question here, non-Zionist Jews, Jewish atheists, all of those populations, anybody who's sort of out of the mainstream, but Jews of no religion, right? I mean, Jews who don't see their Judaism primarily in religious terms, according to the survey results at least, seems like an enormous population of what the sort of Clayton Christensen would call the non-consumers. And the question is not whether and I think that the reason why we struggle with that population and thinking about that from within the Jewish world is because we somehow imagine that our mission towards them should be to turn them religious somehow. How could we get them to become religious? As opposed to saying, how can we encourage them to reimagine Judaism in deep ways let me just throw out there one example of a non-religious Judaism was modern Zionism, and that's been incredibly successful. So the notion that non-religious Judaisms can't become extremely successful is not borne out by the facts. So that's one way of looking at a concrete population that I think would be useful here. And the question about the one thing that we really need to focus on. I mean, again, I think that it's this issue of individual choice. You know, that a Judaism that can be successful in a world of individual choice is a Judaism that has to be extremely attractive, and by that I mean aesthetically appealing. I mean that the notion that it has wisdom that will make your life better is obvious on the surface, and that somehow that's kind of part of the marketing, so to speak. You know, I think that Fiddler on the Roof, you know, Shalom Aleicham's work, it wasn't only about the change of the way that marriages were arranged. Right? I think fundamentally what Shalom Aleichem is talking about is that we no longer have arranged marriages with Judaism. Right? We're going to have a lot of different ways in which Jews may or may not end up in a relationship with Judaism, and we can fight that, and we can, you know, say Kaddish for all of those Jews, or we can accept that the world is changing, and let's encourage new ways of looking at, you know, the institution of marriage. Right? Let's look at new ways of building relationships with Judaism for individuals that may look very different from the ways in which we've seen that in the past.
I'm also looking at Lex's question, and I think he's absolutely right that Jews and interfaith relationships are absolutely, that's the place to dig. That's one of the places to dig. Yep. In those, I mean, they're going option 3. I mean, you can be in an interfaith relationship and be going option 2 and saying, I'm out of here, but most Jews in interfaith relationships are not saying that. And I'm really interested in the option 3s that they're putting down, and I think we ignore them to our peril.
Just in terms of population size, I mean, that's another huge population.
Yeah, and absolutely, those bringing critiques to Israel and Zionism. You know, as my friend Miriam Grossman says, they are the queerest of the queer right now in the Jewish world. And so I'm very interested in what they're saying. And I'm very interested in everyone who thinks they're going option 2. You know, option 2 is a place where your body goes more quickly than your heart. And I think our sense of ourselves as Jews lags for quite a long time, even after we've said, I'm out of here. So what I want to say to those who have gone option 2 is, you actually aren't rejecting Judaism, I don't think. I think you're rejecting option 1, and that's a very reasonable thing to be doing. And you're not crazy. This isn't about you. You are feeling something that is a phenomenon right now. Don't take it personally. And, you know, come to the Beit Midrash, let me show you some Talmud, and let me show you that you're in really good company, and that the tradition needs what you've already figured out. Whatever it is that made you say, you know, I'm kind of out of here, is really, really important. And bring that to the exercise of going option 3. And there aren't going to be a lot of us going there, but that's okay. And increasingly there are more and more, and we're trying lots of different things, and which eventually will come together into its own option 1 that, you know, God willing, in 2,000 more years will crash.
By the way,
on and on.
Just to put one other idea out there that may be controversial, maybe not, but non-Jews is another population that we might look at. There was an article recently, I think, about how there were a lot of non-Jews that are finding Hillel to be a comfortable place on campus. In the time of the Mishnah, it's amazing to look at the rabbis of the Mishnah and to see how many of them were converts or were children of converts. Granted, the late Second Temple period was actually a time of massive conversion to Judaism, so actively sought after by Judaism for various reasons. I think that obviously there are a lot of non-Jewish spouses of Jews. But what we see with our work on campus, and I think with Svara's work teaching Talmud, is that there's actually a very large number, surprisingly large number, of non-Jews who find some of these creative explorations of Judaism really interesting and attractive. I think we as a Jewish community also are not used to thinking about that as a good thing, and again, it's something that can be debated, but for a very long time, where we've had an attitude about Judaism that it was fundamentally people that were born Jewish, and why would you want to be Jewish if you weren't born Jewish? You must be crazy. We have this kind of negative notion of the role of non-Jews in Judaism, and that also may be something that is changing, and that we might want to change. So just putting that out there as something else to think about.
Well, I think you've offered us a lot of food for thought and a really compelling reframing of the way that those of us who feel invested in making a Jewish future look at the people around us and the options that we have. And so with that, we're going to close out. We've come to the end of our time, but thank you all so much. Thank you to Rabbi Benay Lappe of Svara. Thank you to Dan Libenson of JU Chicago, the Institute for the Next Jewish Future. Thank you to Esther Kay for managing the community behind the scenes and bringing the questions in and keeping the conversation going. It's been a really rich conversation, and I'm sorry to cut it off. But ELI on Air is going off the air for a little bit because we have these crazy holidays coming up. So wishing everybody a Shana Tova. Check us out on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, all of these good things. We'll keep the conversation going there. But in the meantime, we'll see you next year. Thank you again to our guests and to all of you for watching and sharing your questions. And we'll see you next time. Take care.
Shana Tova.
Thanks for having us.
Shana Tova.